Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to frequent conversations and discussions about topics that arise. And today I wanted to spend a few minutes with you discussing the annexation that has been proposed by Netanyahu, the Israeli government, and more importantly, the support that we see here in the United States for this initiative. And for me to delve into the annexation, I want to share with you a PowerPoint presentation that really gets us the maps so we understand and visualize and be able to take a look and understand what is being referred to in here in relations to the annexation. So the plan for annexation should not be seen as only a result of most recent articulation of Netanyahu and his right-wing government, but rather has a long history to it. And important to ground ourselves always with the Balfour Declaration and how it actually, from its inception, wanted to erase and completely transform Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Palestinians were not consulted. Lord Balfour says, in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who inhabit that ancient land. In short, so far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate. This is also important because there are protests right now taking place in London to focus on Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill and the destiny of Palestine are intertwined, just like the intertwining of the Balfour Declaration. Churchill was Minister of Colonies, but also he testified in the 1937 Peel Commission hearings, and his testimony was one of the most racist, and this is saying much about his racism toward not only the Palestinians at the time. He expressed racism toward native population, toward the black slaves, and so on. So again, this is a history that's intertwined, and I don't want to go into a discussion of the current period in the US and Europe, but just to know that Winston Churchill himself, both as a minister of colonies and as a person that also put forth the dispossession of the Palestinians as part of his policy as well. So the Balfour Declaration is the first document of dispossession that launches Palestine into the 20th century settler colonialism for the Zionist movement to begin to settle and dispossess the Palestinians. Interestingly enough, that while the name Palestine is mentioned in the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinians are not there. Their only description is given to existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This is at a time where they are actually 97% of the population. So this is, again, if you want to speak about colonial language, if you want to speak about erasure, that sentence in there within the Balfour Declaration, aside from every part of it, but that sentence in there is the erasure of 700,000 Palestinians, their identity, their culture, their history, and who they are is completely erased. Now, as a result of the British mandate and the facilitation of the Jewish migration to Palestine, the United Nations took on the case of Palestine as the British handed the case to the United Nations, and the United Nations issued Resolution 181 that divided Palestine into two states. One is to be an Arab state, not Palestinian, but an Arab state, and a Zionist Jewish state. And in this mapping and the pointing out of the massive destruction that has been visited on Palestine, on the villages, on towns that completely were ethnically cleansed in 1948. The more critical part is in terms of land ownership and how the Palestinians actually, land ownership was something that the Palestinians had the ownership, while the Zionist movement at the time of the UN had barely 6%. And even if you want to stretch it to no more than 8% of historical Palestine was actually owned by the Zionist movement. Nevertheless, they were given the lion's share. It's actually much more of 56% was granted of historical Palestine to be the Jewish state, 43% for the Arab state, even though that they constituted almost 65 to 68% of the population. And then Jerusalem was to be declared as an international city. And then we have what's the war, the 1948 war, where Israel lay claim and controlled 78% beyond what the United Nations has given to it. And again, this is the beginning of what we call the Nakba. The Nakba is actually was a strategy or a part of the plan of ethnically cleansing Palestine. And one of the most important part is what's called Plan Dalit. Plan Dalit, which was the plan to ethnically cleanse the population, Palestinian population that was living in the area that was designated to be the Jewish state. And on April 9th, the peaceful village of Deir Yassin was overrun and the population massacred. So this was the Deir Yassin massacre of 1948 that caused the flight of Palestinians and the escape of so many. So there is often this claim that the Arabs wanted to drive the Jews to the sea, but in reality, Zionism and the Israeli army and military and Zionism threw Palestinians to the sea. And this is the image of individuals, Palestinian individuals that were fleeing in Java on the coast as a result of the bombardment and the attacks by the Zionist forces. So again, propaganda is deployed to actually almost turn history upside down. So the Nakba, 78% of Palestine came under Israeli control. 22% was divided into the West Bank, controlled by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, administered by Egypt. More than 750,000 Palestinians were displaced or ethnically cleansed and became refugees. More than 35,000 Palestinians became internally displaced persons in Israel. These are called the present absent. And 532 villages and towns were destroyed. Now, why do I mention this? Because the contestation in relations to Palestine is still connected to Resolution 181. For example, Immediately after Israel occupied the West Bank, it moved to annex Jerusalem. And per Resolution 181, Jerusalem was to be administered as a separate territory outside of whatever the division into two states. So not only that Israel violated the 181 in the 48 war, but also in 67. So the process by which this Nakba took place is by actually engaging in ethnic cleansing. And Alon actually in here, he says, we walked outside, Ben Gurion accompanying us. Alon repeated his question, what is to be done with the population? Ben Gurion waved his hand in a question, in a gesture, which said, drive them out. And this is the population of Lid, did not leave willingly. There was no way of avoiding the use of force and warning shots in order to make the inhabitants march the 10 or 15 miles to the point where they met with the Legion, which is the Jordan Legion. This is in the Yitzhak Rabin's memoir about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So the Nakba, again, it's 78% of Palestine was taken over in 48. Then we move into the 67, which is the land occupied by Israel in 67, which include the Sinai Desert, the Golan Heights, and the entire Palestine or the occupied territories. All these areas in pink were conquered or were taken over, occupied by Israel, which initiated the war in 1967 as a war to claim and take over the rest of historical Palestine. So now Israel is in control of all of historical Palestine, but added to it is the Sinai Desert as well as the Golan Heights. Following the 1967 war, the United Nations put forth Resolution 242, which right now is really at the core of the debate and the discussions on the two-state solution and how to approach the two-state solution. 242 reaffirmed the United Nations basic pillar of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Now there is a debate initiated again by Israel and its supporters in the US and other areas to say that the resolution speaks of withdrawing from territories occupied and not the territories occupied. So you would think that a definite article does not make much a difference, but in here, those who are supporters of Israel and continue to have maximum attempt to acquire land, try to differentiate between the definite article and the statement without the definite article. Thus, when Israel signed the peace treaty with Egypt in 1977, the Camp David Agreement, and withdrew from the Sinai Desert, Israel said that it fulfilled the understanding of Resolution 242, and then saying that it gives itself the leeway for modification. But from that moment on, after the passage of 242, Israel completely ignored the resolution and began settling the occupied territories. It immediately went thereafter to annex East Jerusalem, which is inhabited by Palestinians. It annexed the Golan Heights, which belongs to Syria. It's a Syrian territory. And then after the election of the Likud party, Menachem Begin, the Likud party, it began to actually systematically move its population to the West Bank and building settlements. In here, what we could say that beginning from 67 on, Israel was engaged in a de facto annexation in the West Bank because moving civilian population to an occupied land violates both the United Nations, but more importantly, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which put restrictions, rightly so, on such move, coming that the Fourth Geneva Convention was adopted after the atrocities that took place in Europe, and wanting again not to allow such movement of populations that resulted in the atrocities that we witnessed, not witnessed personally, but we witnessed in terms of documentation of the Second World War. So again, annexation begins immediately in '67 as it relates to post-1967 war, beginning with the annexing of East Jerusalem, annexing the Golan Heights, and then as the Likud party came in, beginning to annex by moving its civilian population to build settlements, and considering those settlements, in essence, functioning as if it's an extension of the state. All those who live in the settlements from that moment on vote, participate, and part of the political body of Israel. So again, Moshe Dayan, who was the commander of the Israeli military at the time, he said there is no more Palestine, finished. Again, he was speaking from a triumphant perspective, trying to assert Israel's control. So those who at least begin to speak of Greater Israel, in essence, harken back to the control that Israel achieved during that period. In the year 2000, in August 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat met to discuss a final settlement to the conflict. This is a meeting that was brought forth by the facilitation of Clinton, who really wanted to put his name in the history book as a person that brought peace to the Middle East, rather than being known as the Monica Lewinsky president who was impeached. So even what brought the meeting forward in the last days of Clinton's presidency, in essence, was an attempt to rewrite his own history using the Palestinians and Palestine as a way to do that. But if you look at what was being offered to the Palestinians again, and why at least Yasser Arafat was in no position to actually sign on such a proposal, around 73% of the West Bank, maybe rising to 90% in 15 to 25 years, would be granted. Maybe a suburb of East Jerusalem as serving as a Palestinian capital, whether it's area of Abu Dis or right now it's actually maybe Ramallah. 80% of the Israeli settlers to stay, complete with their Israeli-only roads, thus carving the West Bank into three discrete areas without contiguity between them. Israel will maintain control of independent Palestine's borders, so all of that will be maintained. And President Jimmy Carter said no right of return for refugees or the ability to reclaim their lands, their property, their houses. Jimmy Carter said there was no possibility any Palestinian leader could accept such terms and survive. What Israel was offering, just to be very clear in the Camp David, because you get a lot of these smart aleck one-liner people that the Palestinians, that Barak promised Arafat the moon, and he turned it down. It's far from it. If anything, Ehud Barak and Israel promised Palestinians an expanded jail, where, yes, the Palestinians will have access to some of the three cantons in those areas, but the armed guards, meaning the Israeli military, the administration of the prison will have total control, in the same way that if you look at any prison anywhere in the world, the prisoners inhabit almost 96, 97, maybe 98% of the prison. But no one would actually say that the prisoners are free. Everyone knows that the prison guard and the prison institution controls everything. Just think of here, we're in California, we have San Quentin, which is a maximum security prison. Again, the prisoners are there inhabiting the overwhelming footprint of the prison. But the guards, the towers, the administration, the barbed wire, the gates, and so on, makes and controls whatever goes inside the territory. So what in a sense was offered in Camp David is a Bantustan, 3 Bantustans for the Palestinians. Then one has to also superimpose on the West Bank, which was what was placed in front of the Palestinians, is the bypass roads. Now, all these roads that we see in here, this is prior to the withdrawal from Gaza, but all these blue lines that you see, these are Jewish-only roads. What do we mean by Jewish-only? Jewish Zionists, again, for us not to make a distinction between the Zionists and Jewish as a general term, but Israeli Zionist Jews, and in particular settlers who live in these settlements, these roads are reserved for them. So the road itself has a religious nationalist identity to it, religious ethnic nationalist identity, meaning it's only reserved for Israeli settlers as well as Israeli population, to the exclusion of Palestinians who actually those roads crisscross their territories. Now, I want you to look how these roads actually encircle Palestinians. So not only that you are subject to the confines of these cantons and settlements, but these bypass roads are literally like a spider web that is actually controlling and confining the Palestinians throughout the West Bank. And thus, the notion of having an independent state under those conditions makes mockery to the offer, or so-called generous offer, that the Israeli leadership in Camp David and succeeding in Taba actually offered. So again, the bypass roads take about 3% of historical Palestine, and thus the notion of two-state solution with the settlements, the bypass roads, make it an impossibility. This is the Taba offer that was put. What is significant is that it increased the territory to 93% of the West Bank, cut off by settlements and bypass roads. So again, the notion that we're going to give you land, but it's actually we're going to control your life, your movement, your freedom of conduct. Everything is subject to the control. 87 settlements with 35% of settlers. There are about 250 settlers at the time in the West Bank and 200,000 in Jerusalem. So, and again, a territorial exchange was offered in relations to what the Taba offer was given. Now, if we look in here in relations to what is being Palestinian built-up areas that are both in relations to the Area A in particular, and then where there are concentration of the Palestinians versus areas that have been emptied or is under the total control of Israel, for us to understand what is the landscape. And you could see that the major cities are in essence, almost encircled by either settlements and or bypass roads to prevent Palestinians from movement around. Then we get into the wall, the Apartheid Wall, and now the wall is almost complete. It's more than 700 kilometers in length. 54% of the West Bank will remain after the wall. So again, in terms of, because there's the wall that's going to come and cut through the Jordan Valley to almost encircle the Palestinians. 85% of the water wells and resources are controlled by Israel, and Palestinians affected directly by the wall, more than 160,000 Palestinians were isolated as a result of the building of the wall. So again, this is another layer to think about. Now, Gaza has a wall that is encircling it, or fences that encircle it all throughout the Gaza Strip. This is a visualization of the actual destruction that has been visited as a result of the building of the wall. 800,000 trees uprooted, which will be 33 times the trees that we have in New York Central Park. So if you actually think of New York Central Park, 33 times the trees that were in there were uprooted in order to build this monstrous apartheid wall that is one of the, it's an eyesore. If you think about just, not only just from the thinking of what it does, it's just really an ugly manifestation of settler colonialism, of modernity, of actually intruding is one of the most beautiful landscapes that has so much history and so much culture and tradition in it. To see this is another crime. And the not interesting, but the sad part is that I have not seen any environmentalist in the US utter a single word about the uprooting of the tree, the destruction to the natural landscape, the destruction of historical sites and so on as a result of the building of the wall. More insulting is that you have the Israeli propaganda machine that invites people to come and plant a tree in Israel as a way of expressing their culture and tradition and attachment to the land. So this is again part of the silencing and erasure of Palestine. So now we move into the part of the Trump's plan that was projected in relations to what is to be given to the Palestinians. Which leaves us to about maybe 15%. If you add Gaza Strip into what's remaining of the West Bank, is 15% of historical Palestine. And often you asking why the Palestinians don't want, can't come and actually agree to a peace. Well, the peace that has been put in front of us is taking a piece of Palestinian land one step at a time, creating facts on the ground, building settlements, bypass roads, confiscations, and so on. Now, coming specifically to the annexation, Israel's planned annexation, which the idea is to announce it in the beginning of July. For anyone that knows the West Bank, as a result of the Oslo Agreement, the West Bank has been divided into three different areas. Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is to be under the Palestinian Authority control. Area B is that the Palestinians will exercise civilian or administrative control, but Israel will maintain security. And Area C will be totally under Israel's control. So what we see is from the signing of Oslo Agreement, and even before that, Israel has been moving systematically to empty and to force Palestinians out of the Jordan Valley in such a way for an eventual or a planned annexation. And sure enough, today is part of this plan that is being put forth is for Israel actually to claim the Jordan Valley and annex it into its territory proper. And then the annexation of the lands where all of these settlements that exist in Area B in particular, and wherever there are areas under A, that's where some of the maneuvering will take place. Now notice in here that Jerusalem has been left off the discussion altogether. Jerusalem itself, since it's been annexed since immediately after the '67 war, Jerusalem municipality has been expanded threefold. Meaning when we speak today about Jerusalem, it's not the historical Jerusalem of 48 or 67. Jerusalem of today has the footprint of all the lands that been confiscated and some part of it ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, and settlements were built in those lands that were taken from Palestinians in order to expand the Jerusalem municipality. So this is in essence, Jerusalem municipality is populations, settler populations that were moved into those areas, expanding the municipality of Jerusalem. And thus one has to say that Jerusalem as a city under Israeli control, serving as the capital, is actually living off the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and it thus brings the contradiction of a capital city designated as such that itself arose as a result of both expelling the Palestinians and then stealing property and land in order to build whatever infrastructure in there of settlements or infrastructure that is incorporated as neighborhood. And that's what you see these days. These are neighborhoods within Jerusalem. So this is another element that we need to actually speak of relative to the planned annexation. So if we think about what is in front of us in relations to the annexation, what we are seeing, the Jordan Valley, which Israel says is critical for national security, will be under Israeli sovereignty. So again, the Israeli sovereignty the Israeli government will annex the Jordan Valley. Israeli settlements in the West Bank will be officially recognized and incorporated into Israeli territory, which would be in violation of the United Nations Resolution 181, 242, and other resolutions. Now, Palestine will see significant territorial expansion in the form of new land along the Egyptian border. That's the proposal, Kushner proposal, or the peace proposal that was put forth, and it's a non-starter. And such, this is some of the discussions, and then the Palestinians will have a capital city in Abu Dis in there. So we get into the Israel annexation plan. All the dark blue in area that we are looking at under the proposed annexation, this would be the area that Israel will immediately annex. And then the area C will continue to be controlled by Israel, which again, if you see, it's crisscross Palestinian lands and territories. So the question that people are having is, what does that mean for the Palestinians? What does that mean for the Palestinian Authority? One is the Palestinian Authority, as far as I could see, they will continue to exist in whichever distorted fashions they have been, because they never exercised total control over the West Bank to begin with. They will continue to exercise control in Area A. Mahmoud Abbas have said that he will completely turn away from the Oslo Agreement. He he will no longer have any cooperation, security cooperation, and so on. But these are empty words that really does not measure up to the reality that we are actually looking at. That the Palestinian Authority is born out of the Israeli American Arab structure that did not want to see it or did not want to bring forth a Palestinian independent state from the get-go. And we delude ourselves to think that the Palestinian Authority has the interest or the capacity to actually continue in the way that it is seeing itself. One is to undo itself, because if you say that we're no longer are obligated to adhere to the Oslo Agreement, then the reason that the creation of the Palestinian Authority is direct outcome of the Oslo Agreement. So what does that mean to say that we no longer adhere to the signed agreements under Oslo and cooperation? Does that mean that you are no longer a recognized authority by Israel and also all the participants, the United States, and so on? Does that mean that the Palestinian Authority is gonna reconnect back to its relationship to Jordan and to say that Jordan is the power or authority over the Palestinian territories, or that we are an occupied people and therefore we're just gonna disband the Palestinian Authority and continue to live as an occupied population that is seeking its liberation and freedom? Would the Palestinian Authority now re-empower and reaffirm the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the actual custodian of the Palestinian struggle? But there is a problem there. The PLO itself recognized Israel in Oslo. So is the PLO ready to actually withdraw this recognition formally and actually live and consider both the consequences immediately relative to Israel, but what would be the Arab world response, considering that the Arab world itself, for the most part, is fragmented, and some of the major Arab political actors in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and one can actually also ask the role of Jordan and what Jordan's position would be. There actually are, or you could actually also add Oman, Bahrain, and so on, in such a way that the PLO withdrawing its signature will also result in certain disruptions of relations. Again, I'm pointing these out not to say that I am not in favor of the Palestinian Authority completely walking away from Oslo in real and making concrete steps to that end and living with the consequences. And the second, also for the PLO to withdraw its signature, its recognition, which was the most consequential step that the Palestinian the PLO has done with the Yasser Arafat by signing Oslo, giving recognition to Israel without ending the occupation. So that's the calamity of Oslo. It basically affirmed and affixed the occupation and gave it the legitimacy that otherwise it did not have, and we are living the consequences of this process. Now, so as you could see that the Palestinian population centers in the West Bank are to be, in essence, continued to live under the same regime, which is the Palestinian Authority on the one hand and Israeli military occupation on the other. So there is no attempt actually to give the Palestinians their rights. They are not going to be citizens in the state of Israel. They will continue to live under a system of an occupation, and in essence, it's a system of apartheid that we are seeing in there. Now, just yesterday, the congressional Republicans put out a letter in support of Israel, and saying basically that Israel has the right to determine its borders, which raises actually an interesting question. For those who have followed the Palestine-Israel file, know that Israel does not have a defined borders. There is no text in within Israeli governmental text from 48 till now that actually can tell us what Israel borders are. Now, in this, Israel is actually arriving or wanting to claim the notion of Greater Israel, which is something that dates back from the inception of Zionism. Remember that Zionism claimed the right to quote Judea and Samaria, which are in the West Bank. So even the ideological framing for Zionism, the ideological framing for successive Israeli leaders is that this is the core or the heartland, quote, for Zionism as far as its historical connections or claim. Setting that aside, Israel still does not have a defined borders, and even Resolution 181 or the two states framework is still subject to contestation. And both the Israeli government, the Israeli Zionist population, the Christian right in here, and the supporters of Israel in the United States, they're all engaged in willful denial. Denial of the fact that there is an occupation, denial that there is actually a Palestine. Again, I do recommend therapy, but that's a separate issue. There is constant denial that there is such thing as Palestine, and they go into all kinds of logical gymnastics, again, by claiming that Israel was the only state to have a state in the ancient time, and then the only state to emerge in 1948, trying to use a particular framing that the emergence of modern nation state, which is a modern occurrence, can be replicated and connected to the ancient period where the emergence of the ancient Israel, which is the invention of ancient Israel in the modern sense, is used as a form of continuity. Now, if you want to engage in that gymnastic, even that ancient construction of a polity was itself coming from outside to occupy a land that belonged to the Canaanites. So again, how long do you want to go and debate? But that's a separate issue. We could discuss it later on. If you focus on Netanyahu's plan, and if you focus on all the cities, and if you take a look at where these cities are located relative to the population, the Zionist and settler population in the West Bank, going from the north, from Nablus to Al-Karim, Qalqilia, if you think of Ramallah, if you think of Jerusalem and Quds, where Eastern Jerusalem predominantly being Arab, if you think of the north in Jenin, Beit Lahem toward the south, and then Al-Khalil, Hebron in the south, you could see that every area that has a high concentration of Palestinian population will be completely encircled and completely disconnected from the broader life, cultural life, economic life, religious life, completely disconnected. One thing that people possibly here don't know in the US and other places, that Christians from Beit Lahem have hard time to actually go and visit the Church of Holy Sepulchre, which is in Jerusalem. Something that sometimes you could actually walk it on a good day, but now you actually are unable to do that because Beit Lahem is a city in the West Bank, and Jerusalem is been annexed to Israel, and thus there is a restrictions and barriers. So you could actually have Christian Palestinians who lived all their life with not being able to actually go and visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in this one. And similarly, Palestinians from Ramallah or Nablus or Qalqilia and Tulkarem likewise possibly have not been able to actually visit Al-Aqsa Mosque and or Al-Ibrahimi Mosque, where the Prophet Abraham is buried, is actually are unable to do so. So that's as a result of this process that we are seeing. So what we are arriving on today in relations to the annexation is yes, it looks like apartheid. 22.3% of the West Bank would be devoured as a result of the annexation, predominantly this Jordan Valley. It has 30 settlements that are there, 18 illegal outposts, and that's just a semantic. Illegal outposts, basically, these are settlers that just put an outpost, and now the Israeli military supports them and protects them. And until such an eventuality where they actually get some investors from the US, some of these Zionists that actually will contribute, and all of a sudden you'll have a full settlements where some of those who are in the US will actually buy houses, and all of a sudden you have a fully fledged settlement. There will be 12,778 settlers that will be in the Jordan Valley area. 48 Palestinian pastoral communities and villages will be also in the Jordan Valley area, and only 8,775 Palestinians might be actually allowed in or be incorporated into some type of a political arrangement. So 1/5 of this area will be on private Palestinian land in the Jordan Valley. So this is the really what we arrive at is that we have a formal apartheid structure that will actually be put in place in the West Bank. The discussions we had in apartheid structure that is masquerading under a military type of governance, but now we have an actual an apartheid structure formalized into law, meaning that you have populations that are actually formally annexed into the state of Israel proper, and those populations living in proximity, in close proximity, next door to Palestinian population that are governed through a different set of law. Now, before that, these settlers were in settlements. They voted in the Israeli political, in Israeli election, participated in all aspects of Israeli body politic, but there was a distinction that is there, and even there are legal studies within Israel that determine that these settlements are in violation of international law. So now we're moving into a period or a structure where that facade or that barrier of difference is removed, and a formal apartheid structure will be placed in there. Now, I want to finish by actually what do the Palestinians do and also their allies. And I think this is the moment for Palestinians to actually come into complete realization that we are facing, or we have been facing for a long period of time, a settler colonialism. Let me just take a drink of water. That we have been facing all along from the inception of the Zionist project, a settler colonial project. Settler colonialism wants to have maximum land and minimum or no indigenous population to be left. And settler colonialism engages in genocide or transfer of the population where genocide might be an issue. So in terms of Palestinians, we have been subject to genocide. Now, genocide should not be thought only to eliminate the population in total, ethnic cleansing, disruption of the cultural activities, denial the ability of communities to have continuity in terms of language, in terms of their ability to have attachment to their religious and cultural side. All this are part of the Convention on Genocide. So Palestinians face genocide. They also face the transfer, and the transfer has been an idea in Zionist logic and writings from the inception, from Herzl's writing of the Jewish state, Judenstaat, that the penniless Palestinian population or penniless Arab population will be expelled or secure for it employment outside Palestine. So again, transfer, so either genocide or transfer, and also beginning to transform the landscape by destruction of existing landscape that belongs to the indigenous population. So the village destruction, the demolition, and wherever possible is actually taking those lands and properties and giving it to newly arriving Zionist settlers early on, as well as recently arrival post the collapse of the Soviet Union, the arrival of Russian settlers who come and also take property and land. So we're dealing with settler colonialism. Now, one has to say that in the West Bank, Israel have resorted back into a form of not settler colonialism, but motherland satellite colonialism, where it actually struck a deal with a segment of the colonized population, the elite among them, to facilitate its administration and governance of a colonized population, which is the Palestinians in the West Bank. And what we need to actually reconcile to ourselves, that the PLO, with its leadership in Oslo, agreed to become the security force to secure the settlements and settlers and against the best interest of the Palestinian population. Now, whether the PLO and Yasser Arafat and the political leadership hope that it will get eventually to a state, political projects and confronting settler colonialism can't be on the basis of hope. It has to be based on substantiation. It has to be based on deliberate and systematic engagement. So by the time we get into the Oslo Agreement, Palestinian leadership was no longer connected in any way or shape or form to the broader Palestinians inside Palestine as well as outside in the diaspora. And therefore, it was a political leadership that was really missing the organic relationship that have actually propelled the Palestinian liberation movement and the Palestinian movement to a global position at a certain time in the 60s and 70s. So by the time we get to this, it's actually, as Israelis recognize, it's a shadow of its distant past. And as such, Palestinian leadership signed an agreement for it to be recognized in leadership, but it gave out in return the Palestinian rights and claims of Palestine by signing this agreement. So what we need is to understand what happened to assess it correctly, that we became protectors for our occupier. One can argue that Israel has a first-class colonial structure where the colonized population actually protect the colonizer and pay for it with a credit card that they borrow or take from the Arab world as well as the Europeans and others in order to subsidize the colonial control and colonial domination. So again, that's a very important point in recognizing what took place. From this, we need to come into grasp that a reconfiguration of Palestinian body politic and Palestinian aspiration has to be one of the most fundamental pieces that we have to put in front of us. Ending the Palestinian division is foremost, but the next step after ending the division is for the Palestinians to declare independence of historical Palestine. This declaration of independence has to be real, with no fudging between the lines, but rather declare that historical Palestine is an independent state, and it will be governed from exile by a Palestinian government that will combine both those who are on inside, those in the West Bank, those in 48, those that are in Gaza Strip, as well as those in diaspora. Its immediate steps would be to rally the support that I would say is present internationally. Palestinians have a large body of support, have large number of countries that recognize Palestine, and you also have a considerable base of support across Europe, as well as even in the United States, with those who are supporting our rights and demand for rights. So that's, again, a next step. The third or fourth step actually is to constitute the Palestinian National Council that should function as an elected parliament, that we should mobilize to for that election to have a representation based on sound democratic process, not the old boys, old game network where the determination of seats and who gets what based on which relations and phone calls from different directions come to determine who actually sit on that seat. That era of backroom, of completely discounting the rights of people to actually make their determination and their decisions on their future has to be a fundamental step. Having understood and having seen in my own eyes the type of practices that have been put in place that essentially got us into the position that we are in today. Let us be very clear that these practices that have arrived us into a Palestinian Authority that protects the settlers while arrests the Palestinian, those who are calling and demanding their freedom, is the fundamental problem that we have to actually confront as we speak. And I think the sooner we get to this moving, the better. And I think what we need is put your trust in the creativity, ingenuity, really the monumental work that has been done by Palestinians across, both inside the Palestine as well as across the world. And I think they will carry both the future emerging program, they will carry it on their shoulder and they will make it successful. I think we need to recognize that the road to Palestinian freedom and dignity and liberation does not pass through the White House, does not pass through the United States. It's actually, the more that you think that the United States is our deliverance, the more that you will be stuck in the same type of political landscape. Also, our trust in Arab governments have to be set aside. The Arab governments are in no position at this point other than to continue to deal with their own dysfunctionality and lack of recognition, with few exceptions. I don't want to put everybody, but there are few exceptions. I think the Tunisians have been really very forthcoming. The Kuwaiti leadership and parliament has been forthcoming, and a few other leaders. I think the Yemeni position have historically been very, very strong. So again, this is not to put everybody, but the position of the Arab world is in a very weakened position as far as government. But I continue to trust and rally behind the Arab world and the Muslim world but we need to actually give them a full program that they would embrace. We cannot actually translate for them the program that comes from Washington and the State Department that passes through Tel Aviv before it goes to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and then we go out to the people actually not speaking a very sound message, nor we have a political program that will actually lead to ending and bringing justice to the Palestinians. So this is, for me, is what the annexation is, moving from a de facto annexation that began post 67, and again setting aside the 48 for a different conversation. The annexation of the West Bank and the occupied territories begins in 67 in a de facto, and now we are moving into a de jure type of annexation, and in essence, Israel is formally have to be confronted as an apartheid state, while the Palestinians need to reorganize and reconfigure their next stage in their political development. So I'm gonna, in here, stop the sharing of these slides, and I'm gonna see if you have any questions on the Facebook. If you have any questions that you wanna write, I'll take a look at the Facebook and see if you have any questions for me to actually so if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in here, and I will take a look at your questions. I don't see any questions yet, so if you could make sure that you have questions. So I feel that's so. I don't see any questions yet. So I'll give it a few minutes. Well, again, the question is about the Syrian, again, the Syrians conflict and the shift of using Syria as a site of both a protracted war and also players trying to settle their own regional positioning by engaging in Syria is also another calamity, which is have created almost 9 to 10 million refugees, both inside and outside. It fragmented further the Arab and Muslim world, and really very, the Syria's war has been so much destructive because Syria's historical strength and relations to Palestine is well established. So that's also a problem. And this is not an endorsement of the Assad regime by any stretch or imagination, but fragmenting the Arab world and directing the Arab and Muslim world into an inner conflict between them actually, at the end of the day, leads to weakening the position of the Palestinians and strengthens Israel's hand. Now, if the question from Khalid, if Israel is to annex this 1/3 of the West Bank, how much of historic Palestine will it have stolen in total? I think we're getting to about, if you add also the settlements in the West Bank that's outside of the Jordan Valley and so on, I think the total amount of footprint that the Palestinians actually have control of from historical Palestine would be no more than 15% of historical Palestine, and that is being generous because one has to also look at all the infrastructure that is there. So you're talking about a maximum of 15%, but a 15% that is a almost a territory that is like a prison, like a jail, where Israel still control of every element of Palestinian life. Even the oxygen the Palestinians breathe will be likewise controlled by Israel. I think the best way for us to frame it is to frame it as an emergence of formative apartheid, because it's very immediate to actually explain that we have an apartheid structure, that Israel have adopted a formative apartheid structure, that in here two people that are living in close proximity, that are subject to two sets of law, and Israel exercises control over all of the territories. And I think what we need to frame it is Israel embracing and adopting a formative apartheid structure as such, and that should be how we frame what is actually is taking place at this particular time. Even though that we could say that all of historical Palestine right now is subject to a differentiated treatment. Palestinians in 48 are experience a third or fourth rate citizenship, that they're not equal. But one, Israel at least puts the defense that Palestinians are citizens. So in this sense is a fig leaf of cover for Israel to speak that it gives the Palestinians or grants the Palestinian citizenship, and they have the ability to participate democratically. There's a number of Palestinian Knesset member, but we know that the most recent election exposed the deep racism, the deep animosity, the total differentiated treatment of the Palestinians, because had Gantz wanted to become the prime minister, if he embraced or at least accepted to include the Arab parliamentary members, Knesset members, into his coalition, he would have had the majority to form a government. But he could not overcome his racism. He could not overcome Zionism basic epistemic, that it has to have an exclusive Zionist Jewish character and identity. With the passing of the 2018 nationality law and self-determination, that it is only to be accorded to the Jewish members of the state, Gantz in essence accepted to continue to adhere to Israel being an ethno-religious state that practices discrimination against those that it assigns or grants citizenship to. So you could be a democracy and also be a racist or racialized and apartheid type of democracy. For those who are in the United States, when the United States was formed with the Constitution excluded blacks, excluded Native Americans, excluded women. So it was a democracy, but democracy was formed on exclusion, and there had to be struggle after struggle that continues to this day to actually change the contours and to expand the rights of those who were citizens but treated unequally, and continue to this current period. South Africa is another example where you had a democracy that was formulated around a racial democracy, granting superiority, granting more rights to one group, white South Africans, at the expense of the majority populations in South Africa. So Israel in this sense is following in the footsteps of settler colonial states and colonial state, in the sense of creating a demarcated relationship between the state and the targeted racialized communities. So the Palestinians in Israel are targeted racialized communities that are not to enjoy the rights of equality. So there is no equality in Israel. So your citizenship does not give you equality. In the same way that blacks in America under Jim Crow, they were citizens, but they were unequal in this sense. And the law itself actually was structured to affirm this inequality at every dimension or every part within this targeted racialized community. So this is what we are speaking relative to the Palestinians. Now, Noura is asking the question, if the PA doesn't resign on their own, how can we encourage them to step down? And also, can you speak at the protest next Wednesday? So can we, if the PA doesn't resign, that's one of the problem that we are confronting as Palestinians. The PLO has completely been emptied of authority and power. There is no such thing as power and authority for the PLO today. Whatever PLO structure that existed is completely emptied and is like a vacated of any power and relationship, both to the Palestinians inside Palestine structurally, as well as those on the diaspora. I wrote about that part of the Oslo Agreement, which we need to actually comprehend, is that the PLO, by means of entering into the Oslo Agreement, accepted not to engage transnationally, meaning that it had to curtail its work and its operation, and to only be focused on working on the Palestinian Authority. And this is what I consider to be part of the dubious acceptance, at least of no right of return, even though that the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, every once in a while, they put the banner of right of return, but in all seriousness and in all reality, by accepting to curtail their political engagement transnationally, which was the strength of the PLO. You just have to recognize, even before the signing of Oslo, 101 countries or 102 countries recognized Palestine. Palestine had diplomatic representation in 102 countries, far more than Israel itself. Now, the last time I checked, it's about 132 countries. But as a result of the Oslo and shifting all the responsibility to all of Palestinians to the Palestinian Authority, in essence, Israel took control of decision-making for the Palestinians inside and outside and the diaspora, because now you don't have any type of engagement. Let me ask the question for those who work on the ground, Noura and others. When was the last time that you actually had an engagement from a representative of the PLO on actual strategy, on actual step that needs to be taken of material fact sheet informations about Palestine? The only time they actually was an attempt by the PLO office in Washington, in essence, to actually almost disrupt the political organizing that is taking place in the United States and reshape an engagement toward normalization and give the Palestinians who are working in the diaspora to rubber stamp the work of the Palestinian Authority at a time which was most destructive. So if the PA does not resign on their own, how can we encourage them to step down? I don't know if our encouragement will be sufficient. And I think what we need is to begin to seriously push for the government in exile. And this is something that I want to actually insist and push forth, that we need to actually say that we are a people that our homeland is occupied, and that there is no way that you could be under occupation and having an authority that is answerable, receives its salaries, and engages in all relations toward its occupying power. So I think what we need is to move in that direction. And for those our brothers and sisters who work with the PLO, want to actually come and work toward that end, welcome, because we need everybody's skills, talents in order for us to move in that direction. And I think that's, for me, is the next step for us. And I think Palestinians, we have, close to 15, maybe 16 million from the inside and outside. And I think what we need is to begin to formulate that as a way for us to move forward. So that would be for me is the serious step in order for us to move in that direction. Uh, to remind people that in historical Palestine today, 50% of the population is Palestinian. So the notion that we have that Palestinian, there's no Palestinian. The 50% of the population in historical Palestine is Palestinian. So what we need is also to counter the fragmentation. We have been fragmented, so we think of Palestinians in 48, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, Palestinians in Lebanon, in Jordan, so on. What we need is to reaffirm the unity of Palestinians, and that's why declaring a historical Palestine, declaring independence, calling for a government in exile that represents the totality of the Palestinian body politic and interest, and makes systematic way to speak in that form, would be the step that we need to take in a serious way. You cannot be under the direct control of an occupying power that you receive your salaries from it. You will receive your VIP facilitation through it. That the livelihood of both yourself and the population is controlled in that way. And then on top of it, you're answerable to the United States. The US consulate or embassy actually has far more to say and to do with Palestinian political positions, statements, and engagement. The US embassy runs and provides the training for the Palestinians jointly with Jordan and Israel. Is like, if you spoke to some of the people who write on settler colonialism, they'll actually say, you must be crazy to think that this actually the Palestinian Authority represent anything than being a grouping that accepted to be a facilitation to colonization rather than undoing colonization. So I think for us, we have to make that step in a serious way. And I would say we have to go and visit back some of the Declaration of Independence that was done in immediately after 1948 war. There was a gathering of Palestinians in 48 to declare independence, where actually the disruption of that was coming from Jordan. Jordan disrupted the Declaration of Independence, which raises the point, that's why we did not have a state in 48. We should have had a state in 48 because, again, there was a Declaration of Independence that was declared in 48. Then Jordan facilitated a meeting with the Ayan, the dignitary of the Palestinian, which is another problem to deal with. And that meeting basically accepted for the West Bank to be annexed to Jordan, and basically torpedoed the possibility of actually having an independent Palestinian state. All along, again, Jordan had struck relations and agreement with the Zionist organization as far as 1921-22. So those are the elements that we have to actually put in there, and we have to engage in both assessment of our own history and begin to actually establish a solid foundation for us to move forward, for us to really claim back our homeland and be able to do it in a systematic as well as engagement for the future generation. If it's not possible for us, at least let's hand for them something that is very clear and that is very transparent and have an articulation of a clear vision, rather than continue to play the game that will actually make us participant in our own oppression and our own occupation. So that for me is the major calamity. I saw another comment in here by Munadil. Let me check on Munadil. I know he was with us in a few seconds, but I can't see where is his comment. I did not see. Where is Munadil? I saw your question, so I don't want to say that I left Munadal's question اسم على مسمى, you know, Munadal Harzallah. Let's see. Not seeing the question, which is, so maybe Munadal, if you could write the question again, I could actually answer it as we speak and see if it's possible to see it. But again, I think we have a lot of work ahead of us in order for us to get out of where we have been placed. And one part is to actually, the Palestinian Authority has to completely trust Palestinians, reconfigure our political landscape, and really move out from the structure that it accepted to operate under, and for us to have a possibility of success in the near future. I said, how do we create a government in exile? Or Munadal, is just a comment that PA has lost its credibility in Palestine and abroad. I agree with you that it lost its credibility, but the problem that they're still holding the keys to the car, which is called Palestine political body. It has the representation of 132 different countries around the world. It has the diplomatic relations with the European Union, the seat in the United Nations, the arrangement. So just for us, the complexity of what we're dealing with is that you have a Palestinian Authority that really has all the keys to the Palestinian car, but in essence, they have actually agreed to sell the engine or give the engine to Israel, and hired a driver that comes from the United States, which is the US ambassador, and the backseat is filled with all types of Arab maneuvering. So what we need is to ditch this, but to claim the infrastructure, and that's the major challenge of how to claim that infrastructure. And for me, those are steps that we need to take in a succession, declaring independence for all historical Palestine, forming and calling for an independent government in exile, calling for and getting an election of the Palestinian National Council that has all Palestinian representation, and then put a program together in order for us to move forward in challenging and really undoing settler colonialism. And I think that's what we need to undertake. The last part, which is the challenge, I think the Palestinians, and this is something we have to admit to our own self, that we have allowed our own struggle to be overtaken by the Arab world, especially the largesse of the Arab world. We became a movement that was bought. And when you get bought and when you get accustomed to this type of engagement, that was the addiction that derailed the Palestinian political program. And I think until we recognize this and begin to reshape our politics away from it, we are still reproduce the same type of dynamics. And I think, in essence, the Arab world, who were mostly came out as a post-colonial states that were subject to their colonial guardian and colonial motherlands that supported them, managed to actually overtake and reshape the Palestinian movement to what it is today. And I think we have to assess, and I think we haven't yet really made any systematic and clear assessment of the past 50 years of Palestinian political engagement. And it's just, you cannot move forward if you don't assess the past, if you don't assess the mistakes, if you don't assess the challenges, in order for us to build on a solid ground. I do believe that it is still under these most extreme conditions that Palestine will be free. I do believe that Palestinians are some of the most resilient, creative, using the term audacious, uh, networked, transnational, uh, able to weave through in a variety in ways that I would say if people just looked at them and had our leadership trusted and continued to empower this, I think we would be in a different place. So our challenge is that the leadership that we had actually constantly worked to undermine our ability to put our best case forward. And I think what we need is to put our case forward and to put the talents and the know-how that we know, and we can actually recognize the enormity of what we have both in here in Europe, in Latin America, in the Arab world, inside Palestine. Just a tremendous population that you really just should be in awe. If you think about it, Palestinians have faced Great Britain, which I say, Alhamdulillah, is no longer great, because only Allah is great, was the superpower. You're not dealing with what you call a ragtag power. You're dealing with a power that was the major superpower at the time. As we noticed earlier, that the Zionist movement was supported by all of the major powers. Russia supported Zionism. France supported Zionism. The United States supported Zionism. So we are facing, Palestinians were facing not only Zionism, but facing the cluster of all the major powers in the world. Addition, Palestinians also had to face with the collapse of the Ottoman states and the fragmentation of the region with competing Arab claims and competing parties that signed their own deals with Great Britain and France. Egypt was under the direct control of the British with King Farouk. Jordan also was under the auspices of the British, created as a result of the British. Winston Churchill drew the map himself, and up to 1964, the Jordanian army was led by a British officer, Glob Basha, to the period of 64. So again, the Arab Gulf states are directly come out of the British machination and the so-called Great Arab Revolt, which was not great, nor was it Arab. It was T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, an intelligence officer that fomented the Arab Revolt in order to weaken the Ottoman army in the south and facilitate the landing of the British troops on the Mediterranean and coming out of Egypt. So the white officers, again, talk about racism, the white officers would not face a resistance, and the Arab darker forces will be in the front line at the time. So the Palestinians not only faced the British, the French, the support of the Russians, the support of the Americans, but also an Arab world that was ready to sign its own deals, and they did sign their own deals, giving up Palestine at the time by the cheapest bidder at the time. More importantly, also, Palestine in 1917, 1918 to 1920 was still a sedentary, basically still agricultural, mostly agricultural economy, very limited industrial base, facing Zionism coming from Europe. It's already faced the industrialization and modern technology and so on at the time, coming and facing a sedentary population that for the most part have not actually was not yet into a level of industrialization. The fact that we were able to withstand this onslaught really speaks to the tenacity and the strength and the ingenuity of Palestinians that under all overwhelming odds were still able to mount a resistance. Just remember the 1936-39 Arab Revolt. Palestinians were in essence double-crossed by the Arab world, and also Great Britain exiled the Palestinian leadership, killed over 5,000, deployed 100,000 British troops inside Palestine at a ratio of just unbelievable in terms of the ratio. used air bombardment, blowing up houses, cutting trees. All this Palestinian faced 36, 39. Also, Palestinians faced a Zionist movement that is connected to the world capitalist system at the time. So the alignment of resources that were there, that the Palestinian faced, is unimaginable to think about that they were able to withstand. So taking stock of this is not to actually to think of the impossible, but that under the impossible conditions, Palestinians were able to actually mount a resistance to give birth to a Palestinian nation, mostly in exile. The PLO was actually born in exile. Palestinian political movement was born out in exile. We managed to rally people in refugee camps. The Palestinians who were actually working abroad in Kuwait, in the Gulf states, individuals that came out of Egypt, in Beirut, in the American University of Beirut, or the universities in Syria, that they were able to organize. Palestinians who went to exile in Latin America. If you just think about the Palestinians in Latin America, in Chile, in El Salvador, in Argentina, in Venezuela, all this actually, Palestinians were able to create a nation and a state in exile. That's what happened. You get, even before Oslo, before the first uprising, first intifada, you think about it, Palestinians were recognized by 102 states. Palestinians were actually given the ability to speak and represent themselves as a state actor. Some of the major figures in world history recognized and engaged the Palestinians as not only equal, but recognized and saw what the Palestinians' relationship to them. So you can't speak of South Africa anti-apartheid movement without speaking of the Palestinians' contribution in there. Not to point it, but the relationship between the PLO and the ANC was foundational, was monumental. Palestinians were intimately connected to the liberation struggle, to the training that the armed struggle of South Africans that were conducting their operation from Mozambique, but also were coming to train with the Palestinians in Algeria and trade with the Palestinians in Lebanon. And that's why when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, he actually, not as a way of, in any way of what you call trying to make a claim, but these are relationships that were forged in the, really in the ditch of anti-colonial struggle. And the same in relations to Angola, the same in terms of Zimbabwe, the same in relations to the struggle in Vietnam and the Palestinians' alignment in there. And then you get to El Salvador and the Palestinians' engagement in there. So what we need to understand is that type of legacy of struggle, we have to claim it and understand that that is the strength, that is the significant and the place of the Palestinians, and not to think that we struggle just to get a VIP to pass through a bridge, or to have what you call a 4G phone that is handed to us by Israel that is already being tapped and surveilled by the Israelis, so to actually to get our leadership that basically becomes subservient to Israel need, or the fact that we struggle in order for us to get some few computer companies and to have what you call the startup nation, both and connect our economy to Israeli colonial economy, or to be able to export out some Palestinian products made in Palestine on it, while everything of the enterprise is owned by Israelis, jointly produced by Israeli, empowering Israel over us. That's not what we struggled or recognized what we are all about as Palestinians. So I think you tell me exactly where you're headed at, then I could tell you what outcome we have. Today, our head has become intertwined of normalizing and accepting the finality of settler colonialism. I would actually end with the following: if you can't think it, you can't actualize it. So you have to think and act to think that Palestine is free. You have to put it in your mind, and then you go out and actualize it. But if you begin by trying to become what you call a desk under colonial occupation, then that is the limit of your own thinking. And if it's going to take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, it doesn't matter. Time, again, is in a historical realm, in historical terms, can be summarized. You know, 100 years in a history book is one paragraph. So again, you have to think correctly. You have to think again. You have to individuals who want to push for freedom, they have to think of the impossible in order to bring it into possibility. If you begin by not accepting that this is the future horizon, that the free Palestine is the future horizon, then again accept a VIP appointment and get a G4 phone and think that you have arrived in whatever distorted notions of self actualization and self-importance. So thank you. With hopefully that we covered a considerable stretch in relations to the annexation, and look forward to future engagement with you. Feel free to add any of your comments. I'll definitely will read them. And if you have any question, feel free to send it my way, and I'll look forward to engage with you on this. I see there's Mu'ad. There's a question. I was about to end, but it says, Mu'ad, can you elaborate more on Palestinians' governance from outside of Palestine and how we can accomplish that? Again, we think that this was an impossibility. Up to 1993, okay, up to the signing of Oslo, Palestinian governed Palestinian society, both inside and outside, from outside. The PLO was headquartered for some time in Jordan, then in Lebanon, then in Tunisia, and then signed Oslo and came into the occupied territories. But for that period, Palestinians governed themselves from outside, and they were very successful in doing so. Had robust diplomatic relations. They had departments, you could say a Ministry of Education. They had Ministry of Information. They have a broadcast network. They have a research arm. They had, if you say a Ministry of Finance. All those was an infrastructure that was robust. The fact that it has been weakened, it was deliberately weakened through successive attempts, both inside by Israel as a result of the attacks in Lebanon, the attacks in Jordan before that, then later on also in Tunisia. So there was a deliberate effort. I think one has to recognize that the most successful element of Israel's engagement in the past 50 years is the demolishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I think people don't recognize, and I know some people who are beginning to debate between the PLO and Hamas and engage in that conversation, one has to really make a clear assessment that for a long period of time, the effectiveness and the thorn on Israel's side in the international arena was the infrastructure and the political muscle that the PLO was able to actually put forth to challenge Israel. The fact that some of the leadership of the PLO did not take their position, and they did not take their people seriously and betted on Israel and the United States is their mistake, but we should not actually confuse their mistake by discounting the major contribution and the major struggle that Palestinians have undertaken under tremendous conditions. I'm a historian, and again, and a student also of Palestinian history. One should not confuse those things. I disagree with some of the decisions and the steps and the errors that have been committed by a number of PLO leaders and also some of the factions, but I don't confuse that with what the organizations have done at a point where Palestine and Palestinians were almost completely erased with the combination of forces that were acting against the Palestinians, including the Arab world as well. Remember that the PLO was the Arab world embraced the PLO as a way to try to limit and contain the Palestinian political struggle. To some extent, they were successful in doing so for other reasons, but Palestinians were very successful in mounting and reaffirming and putting Palestine into the center of political discourses. If you don't, again, just think about almost for the past 30 years, every political figure in the United States and Europe has had to contend with the question of Palestine and what to do. And this is, again, it's a combination both for the historical contribution of the PLO intertwining itself with the struggles and the political mobilizations globally, and also the success of the Palestinians being engaged across the world. And I think we need to be very honest in that assessment in how to look at what the Palestinians have, what the PLO has contributed, and how to actually make sure that that contribution is accounted for while taking assessment of the mistakes and errors. I would like for us to move to take, to call and to set up a government in exile. I would like for us to actually democratically elect the Palestinian National Council that would represent the broad strength of the Palestinians. I would like for us to reclaim and become far more forceful in our engagement with the United Nations. There's some great, really great individuals that work in the background, but I think that's a seed that we already are recognized as a state within that framework. So these are important steps. It doesn't mean that it's all positive, but I think there is enough in there for us to reconstitute a project on the sound foundation. And I think these are the steps that I would like for us to move forward in that direction and take ourselves seriously. And again, I think that possibility is within reach. Ramzi, it's good to see you. You said, who do you see as leaders from within Palestine and outside Palestine? It's always very fraught to say who's the leaders. I do have some individuals I respect and work with inside Palestine and outside, but I think what we need is to see how we can constitute a new political leadership that has the trust and organic connection to Palestinians wherever they are. I think we need to see what are the Palestinians in the US. We have close to 1 million plus Palestinians in the US to formulate and come up with some level of representation. We have considerable Palestinians in Latin America. I'm in contact with individuals in different places, the type of leadership in there, the Palestinians in the diaspora in Europe, in Belgium, in the UK, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in the Netherlands. So Palestinian Shatat, especially in Europe, to come with a leadership that also represents and come out organically from their work that it has been done and seriously done so. The Palestinians in Jordan, they're both the refugee camps as well as those that are outside the refugee camps. 65% of Jordan population is Palestinian. They definitely will have to have a major say. The Palestinians in Lebanon who are, marginalized because of internal Lebanese politics, but also the politics of the Arab world that has resonance and plays a role in Lebanon. Palestinians in Syria. So all those have to be brought, but at the foundation, it has to be that people that could be, that one, first and foremost, that they have the interest of Palestine and Palestinians, and they have to agree on a program that is rooted in an independent Palestinian state in historical Palestine with an agenda that actually is reflective of this. And I think that should be what we move forward with. And I also, as a person that also recognizes that we have also some of the Jewish communities that have to be also addressed and discussed of how they would actually relate to such a project in the days and years ahead. But it has to be on the principle of decolonization, that you have to decolonize yourself from Zionism, that it cannot be that you could be colonial one day and the next day you eat falafel and you become what you call liberated falafel just because you like falafel and hummus. That's not the type of politics. You have to commit yourself to a decolonial framework which centers the indigenous population, centers the Palestinians, centers their hopes, aspirations, and dreams, and how you connect with them on that basis. That should be the format that we actually engage in. And I think those are the things that we have to articulate and put forth as we move forward in the days and months ahead. So hopefully we did not speak. It's almost 9 right now, but thank you, and hopefully we'll have another session in the near future. Keep working, keep struggling. I know that Noura said if I could speak on Wednesday, if you send me the information, I'll be more than happy. I'm always, if I'm available, I'll come. I'm always ready to help wherever I can. So, Assalamu alaikum. Stay healthy and stay blessed, and continue to work and continue to organize. It's the only thing that will make a difference. Silence does not change things, but speaking and acting based on sound knowledge will make a difference. And I do believe that Palestine will be free. Assalamu alaikum.